Welcome back, everybody. And again, on behalf of Africa Investor, Africa PLC, and the African Tech Summit, welcome to this panel, this Africa Investor RegTech Investors Consultative Summit panel on investability and bringing the models to market. My name is Hubert Danso, and I'm the CEO and Chairman of Africa Investor and Africa PLC and the African Union's Continental Business Network. And I'm going to be chairing this particular roundtable panel with a focus on how the RegTech industry, RegTech investors in particular, can support investable business models that support the African continental free trade area. We've just heard and had an excellent consultation on setting the stage for RegTech in Africa in terms of identifying key trends, problems and opportunities that are driving the need for RegTech solutions and how they can support the African continental free trade area. But for this particular panel, our RegTech investors consultation has drawn a number of different perspectives to date. And what we've arrived at to date through our consultations with RegTech investors are three major observations. The first observation from our RegTech investor consultations, which our panelists here today are either going to, well, first of all, they're going to discuss it. Secondly, they're either going to agree with it, or thirdly, they're going to debunk it. So the first key observation that we've had from our RegTech investors today is that RegTech as an investment universe needs to be broken down and distinguished into two categories: RegTech venture investors and RegTech corporate or larger investors. And I'm sure colleagues on the panel will go into a bit more detail on that. The second key observation has been that the market definition needs to mean scale. What do we mean by that? What we're talking now is the suggestion that there needs to be a more horizontal rather than a vertical approach. Governments around the world have the opportunity to solve RegTech related problems by not just coming specifically at the RegTech problem, because then the market opportunity may not be big enough. And one of the examples given there was Mexico, where Mexico digitalized all of the invoicing so that it actually had to be automated and electronic invoicing. And as a consequence of that, created very large pools of data that RegTech innovators and developers could then begin to apply their innovation and bright ideas about how they can solve problems as a consequence of that. And then the third big observation that we've had to date from our RegTech investors is that the go-to-market, and this might be a little controversial, the go-to-market philosophy is different for RegTech investors versus RegTech developers. And the suggestion here is that the go-to-market preconditions for investors means the existence of regulation and clear standards that foster minimum viable products to be scaled or proof of concepts to be scaled. However, the suggestion is that the go-to-market preconditions for RegTech companies is more aspirational and based on their belief that their RegTech solution can solve the same problem across multiple jurisdictions. What do they say? A definition of an entrepreneur is the pursuit of an idea that no one believes will work but you. And that's how the world is built and the economies are grown. So to address these particular issues, I'm once again joined by an elite and accomplished group of discussion leaders. We have Mr. Alan Jetha, who is the partner at Dentons, a major law firm operating globally and across the African continent. We have Jason Blackman, who is the Senior Director for Customs, Trade and Compliance and Regulatory Affairs at DHL Express in Africa. We have Kenneth Goodwin, who is the Senior Managing Principal and Founder at Genesis out of New York. We have Ramonda Kirktep-Muller, who is the CEO and founder of Moninos. And we have Chris Southworth, who is the Secretary General of the ICC. If you really want to fight for something, it's always good to bring a general. So I'm glad that we have a Secretary General with us in this particular context. So look, to just jump straight into this, I'm going to turn to you, Alan. And I'd really love to get your views on those issues that I've just raised that we've heard so far from the RegTech investment community, which you are a part of and you advise on a regular basis. But really just start with giving us your insights. Give us a bit of a legal tour, if you like, of how you see RegTech on the continent, and also, please, just a couple of other points. Your top 5 regulatory recommendations, just like everyone else, please, for governments on the continent to implement that, in your view, will increase their chances of attracting RegTech investors' capital, and why you believe that will be the case. And also your top 5 go-to-market challenges, but the solutions to those challenges for investors that want to scale their investee RegTech companies across the continent. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you. When we look at Africa, I think if I can maybe give it a different perspective and focus initially maybe just on logistics. 90% of Africa's trade comes through ports. And then we must also take into account that we have a number of countries within Africa that are landlocked. So on the infrastructure side, effectively to trade within Africa and do business to business or business to consumer, in the end, it's getting the particular product to the business. Now, when you sit with 90% of your trade coming through ports, and if you take into account the fact that the systems that are in place in a number of ports, we're not looking at ecosystems like you have, for example, in Singapore or in Rotterdam. So you sit with delays, you sit with lack of information regarding vessels coming in, and then the whole logistics chain from rail or lack of rail, and then also your road haulage. So along that chain, you sit with lots of delays getting particular products in, and there is the opportunity, certainly, if I take one of the busiest ports in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's Durban, where they are looking at modernizing ports within that area. And that effectively is to look at how they can address issues around the logistics chain. So when you look at what governments can do in Africa, certainly the most important issue is really addressing the logistics issue and getting product to business within the shortest possible time. And then obviously the technological systems that you can have to support that infrastructure. I think the second point, which one of the earlier speakers just touched on, we have a number of fiber optic cables being introduced. We've got the Ikiano CCOM route. We've also got the 2Africa fiber optic cable that is being installed. And that effectively will assist to speed up internet and accessibility. Now, what government needs to look at attracting RegTech in the venture capital, I think in each particular country, you're looking at the internal trade structures, for example, the company formations and the ease of investment that is being brought. You're also looking at how small business ventures to be set up and the ease with which that is done. You're also looking at certainly when investors go into particular countries, the question obviously is, do you get your capital out? Are you able to get remittance of dividends? So those are some of the issues that investors would look at when you go into particular countries. Then also to ease up investments, again, at the same time when you invest, where companies sit with IP, whether it's in the form of technology that is being licensed in, or whether it's through their branding or through any IP that they provide into the country. The question is obviously whether the country is able to provide protection for that IP. We also have issues on brands, to what extent the country is able to deal with counterfeit goods, again with goods coming into particular countries, issues around standards, because on a business or consumer perspective, you want to know that the particular product that you get in, that there is brand value attached to the product, and that if there are issues, to what extent you are able to then have recourse when the product it doesn't perform that you require it to do. Now, within that framework also, does the particular country provide for its cyber law framework, electronic communication transactions, and to what extent you are able to get access to the courts and effectively deal with dispute resolution. Then within that framework also the issue of data and privacy protection, when you as a business engage via electronic communication transactions, is your data protected? And I think within the same framework also, if you take the logistics chain around all of the information that comes out of there, to what extent that can be protected. So the other aspect also within a particular government, access to finance when people invest, or if it's a small business, how do you deal with the finance issue? Also when people go into the market and when the business is set up, to what extent do you deal with market conditions? For example, antitrust and competition matters. So those are just some of the issues that I think one needs to take into account. I think also on the infrastructure side, we need to take account of 5G that is being introduced. And then also some of the other aspects, for example, the China Belt Road Initiative, where they're investing into Africa. So in terms of the regulatory framework, you want access to courts, you want your IP to be protected, systems whereby you are able to register that. Now, within many of the African countries, if you look at their IP framework following the WIPO models, they provide for the protection of particular rights. If we look at some of the issues when we're dealing with COVID-19, if we look at how do we ensure that there is free or accessible vaccines and so on, we do sit with some of the African countries following the process whereby there can be compulsory licensing to provide access to those countries. So I just think generally in terms of it's an enabling framework that the various African countries must provide. Now, within Africa, we also sit with various regional economic communities. If you take in the south, we've got the SADC region. Up west, we've got ECOWAS. In east, you've also got the various economic regions over there now. Within the economic regions, they sit with various directorates. Some of the directorates, for example, deal with a policy, it deals with a trade, and certainly within the structure, generally when you look at one first has to obviously have the particular policy, and if the policy in terms of RegTech and investor capital investments in the region, if similar policies are adopted within the various regions, then below that you would then have the legislation that must be introduced in the various countries, and setting up the regulatory framework would then be the statutes in each country, followed by the administration, and that is the regulations that whereby the particular statutes would then be implemented. And that effectively would then give parties access to courts and access to the particular regulatory structures within those countries. So effectively, it's about the various regions that are already in place, following a similar policy, and then having similar systems introduced in the various countries, which would then create an enabling environment for a model whereby the various countries can follow a particular model. I think those are just the key points that I wanted to raise.
Thank you, Alan. You certainly did take us on a tour, an enjoyable and educational tour indeed, and you picked up on a lot of the big issues that are, no matter how sophisticated we want to be and how much we want to imagineer the future, there are still a lot of fundamentals that we need to have in place for these things to become a reality, or at least for these things, once they are implemented, to become sustainable. So definitely this whole issue of the harmonization of policies, which is one of the big issues as you think about scaling across markets. It's not just, does the tech work and can it solve the problem? The issue is, can a market absorb that particular tech and enable it to fulfill its objectives without being stifled? The other big issue takes me back to my post-university days, and I know that Chris's ears might prick here. When I came out of university, when I finished my master's in international commercial law, one of my first roles was at the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, where I headed up as a policy manager for global business, the Trade and Customs Commission. And as you talk about counterfeit goods, I used to spend a lot of my time in Brussels at the World Customs Organization, arguing for companies like Mattel, whose shipment of Barbie dolls used to be filled with all dubious type of goods. And we had to explain to the Customs Administration that we were not complicit in that activity. But huge costs to business and some of the real practical issues that we have to deal with every day. We are talking about capital here. And one of the key things we always know is that international capital will not go into a market where local capital is not being treated fairly. So we really need to create the conditions for our local businesses and our local investors to become good ambassadors and have good news and good stories to share with our international investment partners. And in doing so, we would hope that one of our key objectives is to not create an environment for expatriation, although it should be freely accessible, but rather to create an environment for recycling that capital into more growth opportunities and attracting more returns in that particular market. But I know, not just by looking into my screen, but even if I wasn't looking into my screen and just listening to you, I know all of your talk about logistics had Jason from DHL leaning forward, I think nose almost on the screen of his laptop, edging to get in. So Jason, I'm going to allow you now to come in and just share your views on your top 5 regulatory ecosystem problems that you feel trade tech and RegTech could solve. And sort of just to give us your view on the interrelationship that you think would make a lot of sense between RegTech investors, developers, and policymakers to really unlock this opportunity and create novel and interesting sustainable partnerships in support of the African continental free trade area. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Hubert. So it's been a very interesting couple of months with a rapidly evolving landscapes across Africa and the rest of the world with COVID, and of course we've had to adapt our business model, look at what works effectively, where we've had shortcomings in terms of the landscape that we operate in, and so it's been a very interesting 2 months, and we've got a number of outputs that we've shared with you in the past as well on what we see to be critical areas of investment and development in Africa. And so particularly for DHL, we're looking at increasing the pace of customs clearances in the various African countries, particularly with digitalization requiring things like digital signatures, electronic customs payments without the need to physically go to a customs office and pay in by check. We are particularly focused on working on how can we advance pre-arrival and departure clearance procedures via data risk processing. So the use of data is very important for us. And how do we harness that accessibility to data to increase the efficiencies of the customs processes. Looking at doing license applications and documentary processing online. We've already seen in South Africa, for example, customers have launched their online registration and licensing portal. Phase 1 was launched in April. And so we're seeing some advancements in terms of those areas already in Africa. Certainly, we're looking at wanting to advance electronic clearances with digital stamps and approvals. Another big focus area in terms of the ecosystem problems and solutions that we would like to see would be that of e-commerce, enabling intra-Africa exports and imports for e-commerce, utilization of e-payment solutions, web technologies, and very important for us is fast internet-based technology that is able to function on a 24/7 basis. What we've seen in the past is, for example, when digital systems go down, there is a lack of sufficient backups for those downtimes, for example. So we need to look at what do we do about technology disruptions, internet downtime, what happens when the regulatory systems go offline in countries, for example. Additionally, border management, we'd like to look at using satellite technology to track delays at the border, minimize congestion, and looking at how can we use digital technology to prepare for pre-arrival of consignments into countries. One of the things I was particularly impressed with was when I was in Tanzania a couple of months ago, the Tanzanian Revenue Authority is looking at the use of X-ray equipment, digital images from X-ray scanners to be transmitted to a central pool of analysts who would then be able to risk assess remotely and look at those images and detect whether or not there are illicit goods or whether the goods are not compliant to the description of contents. So certainly I think that digital processes and the use of technology for less intrusive inspections and improved tax calculation and collections at the borders would certainly assist in the Africa region in terms of RegTech and how would you use technology to advance the efficiencies and modernization of our customs systems.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks very much, Jason. That's, again, spot on, particularly when we are, unfortunately, in this era of trade distancing and, really having to look very pragmatically at paperless customs, not just for efficiency reasons, but also for health and safety reasons. And really enjoyed your very practical perspectives there. And one of the big things that sort of has come through from a lot of the consultations to date that we've had is that if you really want to solve a very specific RegTech related problem, from the investor's standpoint, there may not be enough juice, as they would say, in the game. There may not be enough of an investable proposition in solving the one problem. So what you may have to do is look, as I mentioned earlier, more where there is a more investable case, but that also captures and helps you solve that niche problem that perhaps might not be investable on its own. But again, what I'm trying to do right now is dissect the mind of a RegTech investor. And, I don't feel the need to continue to try to explain that because I have Kenneth here. And so I'm going to ask you, Kenneth, to really, as a RegTech investor, to really just help us walk through the process that you take and you approach RegTech investments from, and what your advice would be to African policymakers, governments, and private investors when considering embarking on trade-related RegTech investment opportunities in support of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And please, the more examples, the better. Thank you. Over to you, Kenneth.
I want to thank you very much, Hubert, for having me here. Great panel, great discussions. We've seen a lot of changes here. We're based in New York City. We've seen a lot of change, but we do work with partnerships with a lot of government service entities like the Hong Kong Trade Development Councils, like the Japan Exchange Trade Organization. So we do a lot of cross-border, what they call foreign direct investments that's being done both going inbound as well as outbound. But what we've seen in a typical trade element, you see the top five: e-commerce, intellectual property, state-owned enterprises, which is the small, medium-sized firms, labor, as well as in dealing with environmental issues. Now, what we have noticed, the mindset has changed because of COVID-19. And so what we have done is we've taken what we call a future work and future of living perspective. And the future work, the way we got that is it goes back to your first question, Hubert, in terms of the differences between what's happened with a RegTech firm in terms of a small media enterprise versus a corporate firm. The future work came from a large corporations known as Salesforce, which is what they're doing. They're trying to find ways to get people back to working, getting back to normalization of life. And that's critical in terms of how we address certain opportunities, certain issues that may occur. One issue may be the edutech space that we're seeing. A huge interest in edutech and virtual education in terms of training and development. And the reason why that's significant is because as a former regulator from a central bank, from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, you want to identify, but you want to also report and monitor training development that's being done at many corporations. So we're finding a lot of interest in edutech and virtual education. Another area of interest is supply chain. A lot of these firms, both small media enterprises as well as large firms, are looking at supply chain issues. As you know, with COVID-19, the global supply chain has been pretty much at pause at the very moment. So firms are looking in terms of finding ways to digitize their platforms and looking at third-party investors to come in, third-party providers to come in and actually solve those issues. I'll give you a prime example. We've been working with one of the major liquor firm around the world. They provide a lot of beverages, and they've actually created a private platform that's going to use a combination of blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology, artificial intelligence, which mainly centered on machine learning, cloud computing. And the focus here is to address some of these regulatory issues in terms of anti-bribery, anti-corruption, supply chain issues. And these firms are some large firms in the world. So they address the issues of supply chain from going from the core in terms of how you produce a product to the finalization of the product. Now, the key with doing that is that it addresses a lot of the issues that you have from a regulatory standpoint. So you address the issues of anti-bribery, anti-corruption. You address the issue of privacy in terms of actually identification of different third-party vendors on the platform, anti-money laundering and KYC. So all those particular issues are RegTech firms that actually are being produced. And the great thing about this platform is driven by a large cap firm that's listed on the exchange. So it's driven by a large cap firm, but they're also attracting small media enterprises to come in and to actually fill in those gaps. From the landscape in terms of the future of living, we're identifying how people are living. COVID-19 has caused people to live differently across different urban cities. So you have what they call urban technology, in terms of how you ride your bike to locations, whether you go to parks, in terms of how do you drive your car. So what that's done is that it actually allowed for a level of digital transformation that can be done in terms of big data, where you're actually using satellite technology, what they call location intelligence, to allow for, let's say, the central government of city to be able to monitor and identify for safety and security in terms of how people are moving back and forth. So we've identified several firms that provide those particular opportunities. We realize that is probably going to be the future state in terms of how we're going to be living, both not here in the U.S., but globally. We're seeing that across the globe in multiple jurisdictions. To answer your questions, how would I address regulators? I think being a former regulator myself, there's a lot of examples you can look at, Hubert. And I give you an example. You have sandboxes that are being done down in Australia, New Zealand. You have the sandbox that's been done in Singapore. here in the U.S., the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is using what they call Fed Now. And the unique thing about sandboxes is that it allows for an opportunity for, let's say, a small medium enterprise fintech firm to actually go in and work on some problems or opportunities to create solutions. And that could be from, let's say, GDPR to liquidity issues. And liquidity could be from like the liquidity coverage ratios, where you have let's say a RegTech firm that's actually have an application that can solve that issue, both in-house, but also at other institutions. And those are the things that, I would address in terms of you do have examples that are provided throughout the world. I just recently did some work with the Bahamas. I love what they've done down in the Bahamas, where they actually, one of the key challenges that they had, actually, they identified an opportunity where they saw an asset, and one of the assets were pirate ships. And they were getting those pirate ships offshore, and it was using logistic intelligence, satellite intelligence, to identify these particular pirate ships. And they wanted to find a way to capitalize off that. It's kind of difficult to do that once you pull the ship out of the water, because it loses the value. So what they realized, that the opportunity that presented itself was to create a blockchain technology, and they reached out to a small medium enterprise firm to create the technology to digitize that asset. And what it did was twofold. They were able to take pictures and use those pictures, or digitized pictures, and bring them more to different art shows. And that's how one level you were bringing on liquidity. And the other level of bringing on liquidity was you providing a secondary source of liquidity to other participants in the marketplace. So those are creative ideas that you can do in terms of digital transformation, at least in terms of RegTech firms. I think nowadays what you're finding is that RegTech firms are seeking opportunities to look at the new future living and a new future of going to work. And that, I would have to say, is probably what I have been seeing in the past couple of months, actually.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kenneth. When we spoke in the beginning, we talked about some of the feedback that you had from the investors, and the need to draw a distinction between a RegTech venture investor and the corporate investors, I think, is becoming much more pronounced, particularly on those sort of big, broad areas where, as you rightfully pointed out, the actual investors can become some of the biggest users of the solution as well. So it makes a case for them being able to be at the forefront of innovation in the market. And a lot of those users are big companies working with small companies. And that sounds very much like the makeup of the International Chamber of Commerce, representing the private sector right across the world, both large and small, and really being able to find that unique balance to not complain only, or not critique only policies out there in the market, whether they're generated by the private sector or governments, but being able to put forward constructive ideas and policy alternatives and options. So I'm going to turn to you, Chris, now, because this is right in the steep of ICC territory and your membership of major corporates as well as small corporates. And you are actually shaping a lot of the policy around e-trade, e-tech, paperless customs. There's a Save Our SMEs initiative. But with that being said, I'd still like you to just share with us your key priority issues. I'm going to give you again, and also your 2 minutes with the presidents, and share your views about what 5 priority hospitable policies and incentives you feel RegTech investors should be looking for from governments that are seeking their capital to help digitize trade in Africa in support of the African continental free trade area. The floor is yours, Chris.
Thanks very much, Hubert. It's a pleasure to join the panel and have the opportunity to talk to the RegTech community. I mean, the answer to your question is simple. It's the fundamentals and reform. Those would be my two straightforward answers. And it's interesting listening to the two panels today. It very much correlates with conversations I'm having with colleagues in other regions of the world. I think we've got to contextualize all of this in the COVID recovery. What COVID is doing, we already know we have a sort of macro framework around SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which is fantastic. But what COVID-19 has done is really exposed the trading system for all its flaws and exposed countries in lots of different ways around their inequalities. And we've all been exposed in different ways, whether it's gender inequalities, housing inequalities, trade inequalities, and so on. So what we're not talking about now is coming back on Monday and just starting where we left off when COVID hit us all early in the year. What we're saying now is actually this is an opportunity to redesign the system better so that we're healthier, more resilient, more inclusive, and more sustainable. And one of the areas that's been exposed is around regulatory coherence, policy incoherence, and regulatory incoherence. Systems that are not talking to each other, data that's not traveling between systems, a lack of interoperability, and all of that is making it incredibly difficult to pinpoint solutions, deal with very, very practical issues. And I'm just going to come to a few of those because the world we're looking at in terms of trade is very much around much more mobile global value chains. Global value chains are adapting and evolving very, very quickly, and that's accelerating, particularly around digitization in the COVID recovery as well. So I'm going to locate a little bit on the digitization agenda, following the themes that people are talking about. But really what we're talking about here is highly digitized systems, data flowing, track and trace systems through the ability to track and trace goods at every single point of the transit process, the ability to identify companies legally. These things don't exist today. So, there are technology solutions out there, but they're not widely used. So it's a huge opportunity for the RegTech community to come in and start to fill those gaps because we need to use information better. And trade, you've got to remember, is a very old system. It's very paper-based. There are sort of 4 billion plus documents floating around the system at any one time. To Jason's point around e-signatures, some documents just are not digitized at all. They're still pretty much in the same form that they've been for hundreds of years, like bills of exchange, bills of lading, certificates of origin. Promissory notes haven't really changed for over 1,000 years, except they are on paper rather than stone. But, there's an opportunity to digitize trade documentation. And by doing so, and create the systems that then support the flow of goods, whether it's track and trace, and the ability to follow goods. If we can digitize trade documentation, we can really cut the time, a point that was made on the first panel, from a situation where goods are arriving in ports and then the paperwork is 3 weeks later. That's completely unnecessary. We've got the technology solutions to deal with those issues. There is no technological barrier to that problem. It is purely about political will to get the right policies into place to reform the laws, because most of our legal systems are out of date. Singapore, by the way, is by far and away the market leader in this area in terms of aligning itself to what's called the UNCITRAL model law on transferable records. That's the sort of way forward. And if you want to look at sort of trade deals and trade corridors, the Singapore, New Zealand, Chile deal is the sort of the global benchmark, the gold standard, if you like, in terms of creating digital trade corridors. That's the sort of model that we need to follow. So for governments and regulators to be, looking and examining what is in those trade corridors and how do we mirror that in Africa, because the African, Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think, is an enormous opportunity. It's a wonderful opportunity to really unleash growth right across the 54 countries plus in Africa. You've got the assets of the young youth population. There is already, communities of global leadership around technology. The ingredients are there. But we need the regulatory community and the technological kind of enabler behind it to improve the trading system so that goods and services can flow. So my first point around this is around legal identification needs to be looked at. There are already initiatives in place. Are governments following them? Probably not. Are the fundamentals around internet access in place? Probably not. Looking at the UN delivery in its current kind of pace, we're 50 years off track in the less developed countries of delivering everybody connected to the internet by 2030. 50 years off track. So massive investment is needed in that area in order to then enable the RegTech community. And that goes the similar things around things like data protection rules, competition rules, cybersecurity rules. The frameworks are all out there. They just need to be put into place and enforceable so that we can enable the RegTech market to grow. And in doing so, enable trade to grow overall. So some practical examples there: legal identification, trade documentation, digitizing that across the continent will be transformative. Accelerating, talking about e-commerce negotiations being accelerated, accelerating the implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement would transform trade. In Nigeria, that's 15% implemented. Compare it to the UK, it's 90+% implemented. And what I would say is, in the sort of COVID environment, there is a terrible danger here that the developed countries, or developed economies, I should say, digitize faster and expose an already unequal playing field where less developed economies are already behind the curve. And if we're not careful, we're going to have that digital divide exposed even further, which raises the question of more inequalities. And we've got to do everything we possibly can to avoid that happening. And RegTech play a key role in that, to kind of, take the leap forward and get the continent ready.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. As always, very eloquent and well consulted around the key points. I think one of the big issues that we've in this consultation and this consultative process and this consultative approach has really been to get to the nub of where the opportunities lie, where the challenges are, and how we can intermediate key communities. But in the context of understanding what are the priority areas to solve, you all kindly participated in the second poll. So I'm now going to call on Ashley to share with us the results of the second poll, where we sought to identify the sort of top regulatory issues. I see that for those with a keen eye will notice that it says 3, but on counting, it's actually 5. But very interesting results. We have trade finance at number 1 with 64% as the biggest key issue. We have buyer and seller data at number 2 with 61%. We have logistics at 57 as number 3. We have customs as number 4 at 48%. I hope you're not too disappointed with that, Jason, but we will press on. And we have import and export licensing as the 5th priority. So that very interesting mix in all accounts shows us that there is opportunity, glass half full or glass half empty. Innovators should look at that and see that as 5 defined opportunity sets to potentially progress both at the public sector side as well as the private sector side. And now you've got me very focused and interested in this really interesting polling. And thank you all of the non-panelists as well who are logging in through the live streaming and the viewing and logged in on this roundtable for participating in that poll. I'm going to ask you to indulge me in our third and final poll that Ashley is going to put up for us now. And this really deals with the ecosystem issue, asking on a yes or no basis, should there be closer partnerships between market participants with a particular focus on RegTech investors, regulators, and African policymakers. I'm going to pledge my vote now, and please do the same. Thank you. And I'm going to key up now Ramonda, who is going to be our final speaker for this second panel. And Ramonda, you've really been at the forefront of revolutionizing regulatory compliance and client onboarding in the financial services sector. And I almost bumped into so much controversy because there I came looking into the RegTech space, having the gall to talk to well-steeped RegTech specialists about RegTech being applied to trade and not solely financial services. And as I was very fortunate to find people earlier on who said, look, RegTech solves regulatory compliance related issues. But we're very interested to get your views because you've run the journey, and the journey, regardless of which sector you apply it to, is going to be very similar, one would imagine. You'll help clarify that now. But I'd be very interested to just get your views on what lessons and experiences from a RegTech player and investor you feel could be applied from how your journey's evolved, pioneering RegTech in the fintech space to ideas and strategies and tactics that we can use on the continent and regulators can make provisions for to really drive RegTech for benefit for the continental free trade area in Africa. Over to you, Ramondo.
Thank you very much, Hubert, and thanks for everyone for having me here. It's actually been an absolutely fascinating 2+ hours now, listening to the different views and hearing different opinions and how RegTech could be applied, for example, to Africa and of course elsewhere. For me at least, the journey has started many years ago. I've been in the sector now, financial services, for 20 years. My background is a lawyer. I lived in many European countries as well as outside. And actually one particular area that has always fascinated me for probably decades now is data. Data is phenomenal. Data can make a lot of things. Data can definitely empower societies, empower nations, empower businesses, and it can move pretty much continents forward. One thing we realized in our journey, at least, whilst building our, if you like, RegTech solution to the financial sector, is the journey for us started actually building basically machine learning tools in order to aid financial services, in particular financial firms, whether that be in a bank, whether it's a hedge fund, whether it's asset management firms, etc., on a cross-border basis to be able to do business with ease and without much of the headache that they're encountering today in terms of trying to gain legal opinions. Can we do business, for example, from England to Africa? What can we do with our clients? How can we onboard them with ease without the complexity that's actually sitting in the legislation? So for us, the journey definitely was fascinating, exciting. And in that process, we realized that actually a lot of the data that governments may be sitting on, a lot of laws, for example, as Chris quite rightly mentioned, is actually still in paper and often in many cases, even in languages that today very few people can speak. So of course, that actually created one major obstacle for us in building a RegTech solution that actually truly empowered, if you like, the financial sector to operate. And our vision with it is a triangle. It's to allow regulators to regulate, allow financial firms to comply, and allow investors at the end of it to actually have the protection that they need. But of course, we found that unfortunately that a lot of the legislation, a lot of the actually permissions that we were working with, whether in our sector, it could be permissions, what is a bank allowed to do, what can they do cross-border, what is a financial firm allowed to do, again, in terms of product, services, clients, you name it. We actually found that the permissions that these bodies, if you like, it could be like a driving license if you want to compare it, they had absolutely no idea, and neither did the regulators, even in our part of the world in Europe. So we actually went through many years now. Our company has been founded 8 years ago to start cleansing the data and structure it. And we work with a lot of regulators actually to get that data in some sort of digitized form in order for the market to be able to utilize it. And that has proven to be a phenomenal journey, and definitely one that is needed in order to get to the level of RegTech that we wanted to achieve out of a solution to the market. For me, if we even want to compare it to another level of the KYC AML that I know has been referenced in the first panel and also in this one, even if we look at that, how easy is it really to identify a person and identify their residency just by merely using blockchain? It's not possible. It's in fact impossible today because we're not sitting on common utilities that can be plugged into the technologies that we are seeing today, whether that's blockchain, whether it's using ML, whether it's using AI. It's actually virtually impossible, even in our part of the world. And this is where I feel that Africa can definitely learn from these experiences and actually utilize it as a stepping stone to start from a clean slate and try to figure out how do we start from the first instance of actually putting the legislation in a meaningful manner in some sort of digitized form that allows regulators to read it, understand it, and actually utilize it for supervision, and then allow the market participant to build on that in order to ensure small businesses, big businesses, whichever sector can actually comply. And that, of course, is one of the biggest challenges that we face in our part of the world. And of course, we're experiencing, Chris quite rightly pointed out, you're seeing a lot of sandboxes pretty much around the world these days, not only in Europe, for sure not, in Asia, and hopefully soon also in Africa, where they're actually learning from what's happening. Our dilemma in the first year is that if we want to utilize, in fact, the concept of investors coming in and actually investing in those solutions, how many investors do you think would say, Ramonda, we love this, this is fantastic, you're not going to make any money on it because all you're doing the first 4 years is cleansing data for the regulators. And that has been actually a huge challenge for us, partly because, of course, the business opportunity was absolutely there, but it wasn't there from day one, and we knew it was going to be a long journey, and we are getting there. And that's something that actually has been very interesting. In 2012, when our company was founded, RegTech wasn't even a concept. People asked us, what are you doing? I left fantastic positions prior to doing this, purely because it was a dream. It's a dream to fix a real problem that was not local, it was global, and it still is a global problem that it's hindering businesses from capturing opportunities to do cross-border, whether it's Africa or elsewhere, to be very frank. And that actually has been a lesson for us. If I'm to advise many businesses today, how do you go about this? I would definitely say you will struggle if you're trying to fix a global problem like this. You need to pretty much get to the regulators now with the sandboxes and make them commit. The problem we have today with a lot of these sandboxes and the market is they can't endorse. Endorsing means that they're picking a solution that may make sense. How do you then select, how do you create a competitive field for other players to come in? We love competition. Competition is the way forward in every single trade or project or anything. And of course, for us actually to really try to see how do we go out into the market and try to show that these solutions is what the future would look like. We're technically building AI to actually manage all this workflow from the regulators all the way to underlying investors that could be any of you on this call today. And that is definitely a rewarding connectivity of finding the problem from the source and making sure that it's connected right until the end. And of course, KYC, AML, as an example, we're actually doing a lot more than that on our proprietary engine can come to play. And that's where local countries, whether you look Africa as one or Africa as 54, you need to actually build it as a utility in order to build the trust, which we spoke about also initially, and allow others to come in, other players that want to help out, other players that want to make a difference and change and build the future for the next generation. But of course, what comes with all that now and that's probably going to be a challenge in any event, is of course, how do you control all these blockchains, all these artificial intelligence, who's running them, who's controlling them, which companies, which countries. And on top of that as well, you have now the ethical AI coming into play in our part of the world, in Europe. So when you go out and you're building those RegTech tools, I'm not talking about a small Excel sheet that becomes automated. I'm talking big, where you are technically changing the way that the whole future is going to look for the next generation. And we are definitely getting there. And by getting there, we need the support of the regulators, we need the support of the market players, and of course also the investors, to actually see it as a connectivity and not just as one single opportunity to harness a change in a small sector. What we are doing today can be taken to the medical sector, it can be looked at in the trade, it can be looked at in pretty much everything that we are doing today. It's a triangle, and that triangle can be connected. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment. And basically, the young generation that are coming with dreams, we had that mentioned a lot on the first panel, where they're becoming creative. Don't kill them, empower them. Give them the tools to make those changes and to actually find out what could potentially impact a lot of these in the future. And you'll find that many of the best tools that you see in the market today, Hubert, we talked about Tariq not long ago, you'll find they all started in a small company with a small dream that became big. So that's my contribution to that, Hubert. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramonda. A very nice and inspirational and fact-based way for us to end. I think what's become very clear with what you're saying is it's a mission, it's almost a calling, it's a commitment, it's refusing to lose, and we certainly refuse to lose to create a better future for the next generations. And we passionately believe that, you know, we can do this in close collaboration and partnership with all facets of society, civil society, business, policymakers, and governments. But again,
and in Africa, you've had many successful stories and many enormously successful projects that could definitely be taken cross-border. Absolutely. Fantastic.
Well, with those remarks, Ramonda, and the fact that we do not have any questions and answers, and coupled with the fact that we are over time, I'm going to move towards closing this RegTech Investors Consultative Summit. But before I do, I'm going to call on Ashley, if she could please present the results from the final poll. My goodness, once again, very overwhelming support for a call for partnerships. And it almost brings me to the African adage, where we believe very passionately that it takes a village to raise a child. And RegTech is a child, you know, a very nascent, very early stage. And according to the results of the poll, and all of you around this table and logging in from all around the world, I think you've endorsed the fact that, you know, we all will accomplish this together. So with that said, I'd like to thank each and every one of you, speakers, people that have logged in, people that are viewing. We count on your continued support to help us meet our objectives of bringing, you know, very positive contributions to create an environment for technology more generally, and RegTech more specifically, to contribute towards the overall success and sustainability of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I'd also like to thank Ashley and her phenomenal team and the African Tech Summit for their partnership on this particular successful event. And we look forward to working with each and every one of you going forward. So with that said, I formally bring this Africa Investor RegTech Consultative Summit to a close. Keep safe, everybody, and we look forward to speaking soon. All the best.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.